Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval French nobility, a topic which we have already addressed several times indirectly and specifically for some times in medieval France, mostly the High Middle Ages, the very important, as we will repeat today, definition of noble lineage during the 9th, 10th century, the creation, eventually properly the knightly class, if of such we can talk about, and that we will probably expand on also at some other level, considering how the French state that was essentially being built from 13th century onwards with kind of modern and paradoxically, even though we can't say secular characteristics per se, but surely it was heading towards that direction of broader dilution of what was actually the original and traditional concept of nobility in many ways, that France embodied mostly because of the aristocratic nature of its establishment, and so kind of balanced the thing, but kind of propelled a broader, let's say, in fact, modernization and secularization from the state that in fact would emerge more more prepotently in the 17th century as the continental hegemonic power, and that would trigger, as a consequence, also the revolution. All in ways, again, that when you approach these things from an ideological point of view, it's other those were pro and against this phenomena. The point there being that there were always options to do the same things in better, worse ways, or in right and wrong ways, if you prefer, and not necessarily, of course, always the best emerged, but the concept in itself is more complex and double threat than it seems, and so I'm probably being hermetic about these differences at this point, but I plan, if everything goes well, to discuss them in autumn, in winter, because I see a lot of general disorientation when it comes to defining values and even thinking that whatever we think today has any of it. And I'm not winking again at any specific side of the aisle, because simply the average person has completely no idea what that means. You don't understand European tradition if you're a conservative per se, right? It has basically nothing to do with that. Nor if you're liberal necessarily, you cannot understand what lays at the root of tradition by some other degree that, however, should be corrected from all the degenerations and the actual engineering and forced ideologies that have poisoned essentially our way of thinking in many ways today. In any case, what is important to stress since the beginning about the system is that one form of nobility or another had been dominating goal since the Bronze Age, right? And this would go on effectively until the Revolution, 1789, 92, if you prefer, with the end of the monarchy that anyway came back in other ways and other forms. So this continuity, especially from the Bronze Age to the modern or contemporary age, as a matter of fact, is already something difficult to digest for many who, for example, see the Roman domination as something different or not in line or in tune with what even, revanchistically, in a barbarian sense, it's thought it were exactly the same thing. And actually the Roman tradition was also even more radically ideological about the same hardcore pre-existing tradition than we imagine. And there is also, in fact, a continuity that could be traced, in fact, from the Celtic nobility of the Iron Age and the Gallo-Roman senatorial one of the empire, and naturally with the later Frankish one that and one of other peoples. Frankly, it's Merovingian would be proper at that point that we start with today, and most scholars, in fact, believe at this point historiographically that the nobility of landed magnates that presided over the Western Frankish kingdom between or kingdoms if you prefer, because there is also the gradual fragmentation with Burgundy, etc. So yeah, the Western Frankish one is just Neustria fundamentally, and but the Gaul was overall dominated, even though with important differences also from an ethnic point of view, by this essentially Celto-Roman Germanic noble descendants, right? And we will probably get more in detail about this in other videos, because again, the differences are important, but the broader picture is fundamentally that one: the continuity in Gaul of an elite system that fundamentally was unchanged by the Germanic invasions, and that actually shrank together with the rest of the community for reasons that happened after the Saint Germanic establishment, and that more or less encompass all the contraction of Eurasia at that time. So this would have been a fait accompli by essentially the beginning of the 7th century, where the Gallo-Roman Germanic element was completely blended. It was essentially taking part of a universal empire rather than a Germanic kingdom, as we have stressed imposantly in our series about Merovingian history. And that, for this reason, also was part of a broader hierarchy that nowhere else in Europe fundamentally had the same constitution, right? The Byzantine world was very oligarchic in nature, possibly and surely even more actually than the Merovingian Empire, but still the concept of nobility was extremely different from west to east. And this is true even when we look at for example, the differences that still existed, at least before the Gothic War, between the Italic nobility and the Constantinopolitan one. In fact, we made 2 videos about this topic. On the reason of which we cannot digress today, because it would be too kind of powerful and also ideological probably for somebody who states this, but that still has a very strong historical evidence at the base. So what we look at today as France, more or less comprehended between the 7th and the 13th century, even beyond, and especially the 13th, where, as we will see, things would change radically with the consolidation of the Capetian state rather than just a monarchy. Were named normally in the Latin sources, and whoever has worked on them knows these things by heart, like potentes, proceres, magnates, principes, nobiles, right? And all these names naturally have, throughout the centuries, different shades and semantics, etc. We can't digress on this either. But they identified prominently what was essentially the Gallic situation. I say Gallic here to stress properly what lays in this broader world that was influenced in a way or another by what is northern France, and so mostly properly the cradle of this ultra hyper aristocratic elite dominated kind of culture that also spread as literally the foundation of Western European identity as we understand it in all models, right? Throughout also the crystallization during the Ancien regime, etc. So, and today, as you have probably already understood, we will talk about kind of the scalarization of the system. I made videos about late medieval and also early modern warfare that talk also about the crisis of chivalry, and say the hypostatization of the same concept of nobility and lifestyle and ethos, etc. But this goes beyond France. It's just France accelerated this more than the others, paradoxically, because it was the most updated state in Europe, the most powerful one, the most advanced, the largest. And so certain dynamics that we will see in the West and in all the rest of the world by different times, different degrees, basically is well exemplified by this powerful French example. So it's fair to say that throughout all these centuries, what we look at in terms of French nobility, it's the descendants of the 6th and early 7th century fusion of the pre-migration nobility of the Frankish and other Germanic tribes, and not only Germanic ones, think about the Alans that settled in Orléans, for example, in Gaul, with the remnant to the of the Roman senatorial nobility already established there, and more specifically, probably of the political marriage between these two elites, right? And especially the elevation of the Germanic ones to the levels of living of the Gallo-Roman ones, given the astonishing amount of wealth that Gaul had in absolute terms, given that, differently from other provinces of the Western Roman Empire, had fundamentally remained untouched, or at least not structurally or systemically compromised by the migrations, by the disruptions. A bit of the same is true for Spain. In fact, that's the main axis that we look at normally when I made lots of videos about the migration here, explaining the difference. Like Britain and Italy and Gaul and Spain, these are the couples that kind of resemble each other the most in terms especially of wealth distribution, or at least in relative terms to politics, right? And so what allowed the Merovingians to take off was this pre-existing situation, but the direct immediate marriage with the Catholic senators / bishops that granted Merovingian power to be established without any smoothly, without any trouble, unlike Spain that before converting to Catholicism took a very long ride. It was also defeated by the same Franks in Aquitaine, as you know, and it was in this sense also more geographically perhaps less geographically favored after all, but surely had a huge potential that, partly because of the political religious divide, it was political in nature, right? It didn't really have much of a religious nature for real, because the conquerors fundamentally assimilated very quickly also, just from a demographic point of view. That is evidence, but there was still, it were different factions that kind of were nurtured for a longer time on a specific debate of government model that the Visigoths lingered on, while not the Franks, but the Merovingians specifically, by taking out all the competitors and establishing this connection with the Gallo-Roman elite, could afford founding, in fact, the most successful power in Western Europe by far, right, in stripping essentially the Goths of the, say, the political direction of Western Europe. And again, I've made plenty of videos about this that you also enjoyed, particularly for sound reasons. So I sponsor them a little bit even more. So when we look at this Merovingian and also Carolingian nobility, we look that it maintained a very important feature of the traditional sacrality that was natural to the original universal culture of the world. It is true that this was an incredibly aristocratic system, that the same Merovingians, as we've seen, had factually betrayed the kind of Germanic egalitarianism by taking out literally everybody who was not at the top, that were themselves. So literally making a bloodshed that would never end, and increasing dramatically the divide between the ultra elite and basically all the rest of the people, which was completely alien to just even some areas of the same Frankish realms like Austrasia in the Far East, that however also showed dramatic changes in that direction, still being under broader Merovingian rule and role models, etc. But the concept was that there was not really a legal definition of nobility. Right, nobility was essentially expressed as a form of moral and partly also physical superiority and material superiority in practice, because of all the enormous wealth that they owned individually of its members. Right, they were distinguished from the inferior orders not only, in fact, by the possession of, for example, the villa estates that would transform into the medieval court this, and the attached luxurious lifestyle that their income made possible, but a transcendent right of lordship that they exercised as imperium fundamentally, because that was the only universal belief that existed in the world at the time, over their, in this case, over their extensive household, which means people that were, in theory, many of which were still free in theory, right, free tenants, then and clients of any sort, and the virtual monopoly that, however, enjoyed over the government entire, right, the higher offices of the palace, the provincial administration, and the church, right, and all this, as we've seen, dramatically often in our, in fact, what I'm proud, it is pretty hefty Frankish history playlist, and also talking a lot about the church was crucial in this, and be absolutely certain of this, that if you don't study Christian ecclesiastical history in the Middle Ages, you cannot understand any single thing about anything. So completely just stop studying history already if you think that you have these barriers. I say this because when I make something about Christian history, nobody watches it for some reason. Well, just know that if you think like that, you don't know anything about history. And I stress that, not just because you, of course, don't know anything about ecclesiology or anything, but related to church administration and policy, but because the mere concept that you can presume to dream to understand history without that balance basically rules out any possibility to understanding any moral material balance medieval history whatsoever. Even worse, if you think that you can skip that by studying just pagan communities, that simply means that you have not the palest idea of how the world was ruled, by whom, how, on base of which principles. You don't know anything about history of religions and the true meaning of European tradition and universal values, and basically you're completely deprived of any dignity of cultural worth, and you should be emarginated by the rest of the community and become just remaining part of the fourth estate to which you belong, and that you would have belonged at the time, by the way, because this was the point. And without any awareness about the universality of tradition, you simply cannot afford to have a moral superiority, right, and power and dignity and value, right, and you would end up to be a servant. So even technically not even a full human in the view of the people that very often you just pretend to learn about and would have treated you as such, frankly. And I always like to stress the art of the verb frankly regarding these topics, exactly because that's exactly what they would think about, and during the first 7 centuries of Frankish rule, that, as we've seen, absorbed this hyper-hierarchic, elitistic, and properly aristocratic, both lay and ecclesiastical lordship of the Western world hegemonically. The nobility remained a group closed, in principle, to any but the descendants of its original members. In practice, it was not completely like that, because what we see, especially during the expansionistic phase of the Carolingian Empire, essentially the restoration of the same Merovingian and Frankish power that, as you know, by the end of the 7th century was factually, inconsistent. It was just, a foretaste of what would have become again in the 9th to 10th century in a disgregated fashion. The united nobility of the Frankish kingdom abandoned both the patrilineal structure and the surnames characteristic of the Roman senatorial gentes. Why? Well, in part because of the crisis of the demographic and economic one that would essentially render even the average nobleman, that was, again, in France, more than in any other place, superior to any other in Western Europe in terms of properly of individual power over of the rest of the masses. Still not particularly affluent, but this was a moment of dramatic material poverty, right? And so it doesn't matter how many people you really owned, but still the broader necessity of say, connecting yourself at a greater international level really depended on the capacity of having those actual links and having an actual power overall. In other words, the more the empire disgregated in this, again, towards the end of the 7th century and eventually in the late 9th and in the 10th, the more the single lords locally went on their own. And as we will see, this meant that by the migration era, that had injected also demographically, especially in northern France, this Germanic element that still revolved around the Sippe, right? And so this important blood tie, but still in a clanic sense. And later on, some proper, lineages that started, in fact, from the place from what they came in high medieval times, right? That were instead connected to the name of the fief, right? And who had Eldad. And this is an interesting comparison because they are similar dynamics, but with a different outcome still in regard of onomastics. So the Gallo-Romans were the majority of the population, and the same Germans that were all blended now, Latinized the German, say, leading names, that is to say, not even properly the ones that we largely also ignore what they actually could be, but properly the ones that during the migration era were used to designate the leaders of the confederacies and so on. So with this strongly political meaning, if not properly. Well, they were all military etymologies, but still, that's what they meant in the broader international arena. And thus tracing their noble ancestry as much as actually in female as in male lines. Right, and this is a consequence, of course, of the collapse of what was the by far much larger Gallo-Roman clientele. Right, the latifundia existed, remained, power remained concentrating in the hands of the few, but in relative terms, for what the average of the rest of Europe really was, not in the sense that in absolute terms these people were richer. As a matter of fact, again, you can easily see how even Merovingian power throughout all the 6th century started from, these big, hefty, bulky armies, even with Roman, elements still next to the Germanic ones, and catapults and everything that even logistically was similar to what the legions had used, right? In the late 6th century bloody clashes between the Merovingians themselves that are just basically hunting parties, right, by size and by practices, by tactics. And so, yes, these people had factually monopolized the world, because in the meanwhile, this collapse meant that the average person had lost further, relevance in absolute terms, but perhaps had gained more in relative ones. Again, it was not like a particularly, likable situation. These people did not revert to some kind of absolutely of freedom or anything. Like the Celtic world of Gaul was brutally elitistic and feudal minded, and already factually by the time of the Roman conquest, the Gallic chieftains were rich, powerful people for which all the rest factually worked as serfs, even though in theory they should have been freemen. So the thing remained exactly the same. It's just in relative terms, yes, there was this greater reliance on this smaller original clanic names, kind of affinities, communities, kinship of the Sippe that in fact Germanized culturally the same overwhelming Romance majority as well, including the elite that fundamentally was still there and still blending with the same Germanic one. Also for this reason, but not only, right? This happened also in other countries. It happened in Britain, it happened in Italy, it happened in Spain. It was pretty much common, right, that the Romance majority was also Germanized culturally, right? So that they would speak factually a version, a version of Latin, what had been Latin, but still they would call each other with Germanic names and consider themselves also kind of nationally in the Latin sense of the word as Germans, which is very, very interesting because demographic data are absolutely clear about this. The Germans were a very small minority, but still this new kind of regime was able to conform to the to the needs of, at the end of the day, the same aristocrats that had been present there, and heading towards a cultural transformation in the process. And that's the radical importance for in the history of mankind of Romano-Germanic identity. In any case, this arrangement must have permitted the admission also in the nobility of both men and women with only one noble parent of either sex. So they were much more open systems in early medieval times than, of course, what in late antiquity it was dramatically more elitistic could be. And this was evident especially through the military clienteles of the Carolingians, where something was changing also properly in the nature of the relationship existing between the king and his clients, right? Kings could and largely did confer rank within the nobility by granting the temporary tenure of a high office or dignity, honor or dignitas, such as those of duke, count, and bishop. And this was done especially in the lay elite by sometimes electing simply a guy who maybe had very obscure origins, but had, I don't know, distinguished himself in Charlemagne's army, and so he would elect him to counter the push of the nobility that St. Carolingians were understanding that was the bigger problem for the possibility of cohesion and centralization that, in fact, not even the most powerful Carolingians managed to achieve, if not by boosting dramatically the weight of ecclesiastical power that was still made up of the same nobility, but still had very different mechanisms of properly assets management and land management, property management than the lay one. So during the civil wars of the 9th century among the Carolingians, the leading nobles succeeded in making the newly received gubernatorial dignities hereditary in principle in a single lineage, thereby depriving the king even of the power of promotion and demotion, right, except in extraordinary circumstances. How could this happen? Well, importantly enough, the expansion of the Carolingian Empire had brought, in fact, to this redistribution of power that in order to control more directly, and like what had become the norm in Merovingian times, this immense territory, this vast Atlantic plains stretching all over Western Europe, the various territories, they had to be loaded in local power, right? They had to be rewarded. If you wanted them to be effective, to rule within and, let's say, crushing, let's say, rebellions and expanding foreign territories, you needed an effective de facto professional force that had to be kind of more engineered from a political institutional point of view, which the Carolingians, starting from Charles Martel especially, accelerated dramatically. So giving origin, at least, to the mechanism for which what we know ideally is the medieval chivalry would have been consolidated and we shouldn't stress too much, especially at that temporal, those beginnings, the difference from Merovingian times, because factually it was already a reality, right? The aforementioned potentes, proceres, magnates, etc. were those who had largely controlled this various local assets and maintained at the same time kind of a military lifestyle. You see, a Roman senator would have not ideally done it, right? Those who really owned enormous chunks, let's say, of Italy or Gaul originally, right? Because they were so powerful that they simply that were part of a broader state and system that had a professional army, etc. And this kind of totally degraded reality, and especially in the Frankish world, where properly there was no public idea of power, like it was or idea of state properly, right? It was all based on this kind of personal cliential relations that in turn, yes, were not so different even from late antique again, senatorial clienteles by some degree, but still were something kind of smaller in comparison to the most flourishing model of the origins. We're still kind of between, again, these clashes, because also the system was unstable. The Merovingians always fought against their blood, and so the military lifestyle, but still the wealth, found this compromise that, given the collapse also of the late antique system in other lands, made, in this sense, France kind of, in relative terms, superior to the others, but still with an important resizing compared to the previous model. That's, again, even the changing in the onomastics and so on, and that's why the Carolingians couldn't effectively rest their power but on these still what were private clienteles, that when the empire overstretched and didn't find any valve for venting itself, began to simply to collapse from the within, as we have seen. Still with some effort to avoid this, but factually without even having a chance retrospectively of succeeding otherwise. And that's why between from in the 9th and 10th century, there is a new affirmation, a new fueling of these local lordships to the point of creating individual lineages that become so also homogeneous and widespread all over post-Carolingian Europe. So also in regions that up to that point had not, like Germany or Italy, had not shared the same properly Frankish Gallic system, right, in terms of wealth distribution, etc. With different outcomes, naturally, that we have also seen very often in high medieval Europe, talking about warfare, for example, but also generally about society. So between, let's say, at the end of the 10th, at the end of the 12th century, the kings of France, or better, the Western Frankish kings, conferred no important lay dignities outside of their own immediate family either. So it's as if the older Romano-Germanic model that was still in theory based on the idea of some kind of equality from the ruins of the ancient state and the theoretical egalitarian Zippe had by this point completely aristocratized and privatized. So much that not even the kings relied on anyone but their own kins as and therefore familial ties for political loyalty, right? And this is in fact what brought to the important historiographical definition of feudal monarchies, the idea that the feudal state even, right, something that would seem like an oxymoron, but that is factually real, because kingdoms like even the Western Frankish one or others that we see emerged also quite randomly, right, especially the Western Frankish kingdom, in part exactly because of all that fragmentation that was the largest, right, politically wise, exactly because France was the cradle of that privatistic, ultra personal power scattered among all these smaller lords, differently from Germany, differently from Italy. Burgundy was a bit similar, but never as much as in Neustria, as in the Loire, Seine, Scheldt estuary. Like it was like enormous, right? And it was the very center, in fact, of Frankish power historically. It could have just not eventually consolidated along a power that would unironically become the most powerful state in the Western Middle Ages, at least in terms of sheer power. Of course, the Norman monarchies like England and Sicily were much more states than France in a sense was, but let's say starting from the 13th century, the massive power deriving exactly from those paradoxically private Capetian power as they had nurtured it, like other princes in their case in the Ile-de-France, managed to take over like any other, and to having the resources to skyrocket also statally, bureaucratically. This is pretty evident. It was also strongly backed by the papacy, as always. The connection there is since Merovingian times quite clearly between the Roman and the Gallic Church, and in other powers, like say Naples, for example, that the same Carpathians conquered, as we have seen recently. And so bringing really the best of the most updated administrative systems, like bureaucracy was born not in the modern age, was born in the Papal Angevin alliance, right, in systems, and the overwhelming amount of money that they control. So the emergence, let's say, between the mid-9th and the mid-10th century of hereditary duchies, counties, and viscounties, and then between, say, the last decade of the 10th and roughly the 12th century of hereditary castellanies carved from their territories, changed both the nature of noble power and the structure of the noble king group, right? So you immediately understand here that there is a progression, first of the bigger chunks, right, that become hereditary. Think about the famous capitulary of Quercy-sur-Oise that defines this. Charles the Bald was trying to keep together Western Francia before it kind of collapsed, and therefore said, okay, well, I will co-opt the major powers of this, most powerful, politically, strategically, districts, so that in exchange they will recognize me as a king as the guy who at least provided them with this legitimacy. So I will be recognized as a king, paradoxically, by giving away part of my power for them to still consider me as the authority who provided them with such. And it worked. It worked. Right, it's oddly enough, but it was difficult, but it still made it in the end. It's basically what the entire Middle Ages Western Middle Ages were based on in many ways. And then this thing went down to even the smaller, like the castellanies, right? Just essentially guys who control a castle, right? So not a big deal. Of course, some of them could become more powerful in that sense, but to the lower echelons, right? And therefore, the famous also 1037 Edictum de Beneficis, issued in the Italic capital by the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad II, who was saying from his own side, also Charles the Bald had been emperor factual, the only, we could say, French emperor, right? Western Frankish at that point. I'm saying in terms of who ruled that northern France at that time, right? For the rest, there were also Luxembourgs who were French emperors, but that's another thing. Later on, to say, okay, well, we gave very much power to the bigger districts. The lesser ones are also kind of growing importantly, because there was a phase in which also from the, Europe was re-expanding. So also from the bottom up was an important, again, case of knights, as we'll see now, a re-expansion. And we can use these lesser guys to, that are somebody's vassal, right? So all of the larger district holders to check the latter, right? And so this is the full. These are Quercy and the Edictum de Beneficis. They are the cornerstone of feudal Europe. It was all based on them formally, and they were just the most obvious and open, consequence of that state of things. And this mechanism naturally brought to the transmissions of these dominions to sons by primogenitors, as the issues properly allowed, leading to the re-emergence of patrilinear houses, like a bit in late antiquity, that normally took both their identity and from 1050 their new hereditary surname from the dominion held by their chief, because they were becoming finally something in absolute terms larger, right, and very large at some point. There was all a gradation now, though, because the great difference with the late antique state is that the late antique state factually was, at least formally, was an entire state. Yes, there were some kind of provincial differences, but let's say it was a fixed administration. Feudal Europe was a total entanglement of an enormity effect of vertical and horizontal division, transversal connection. So this, what was happening at the lowest level of this hierarchy was still very important, especially in an expansive phase, right? It's a bit like also in the Roman Empire it had happened with the senators kind of ruling, then the knights literally, being integrated by fully in the political institutional system of the empire to also check the nobility in part later on. So it's a bit like the same thing. So the norm is what we see in medieval Europe. You have a house practically that owns some important power, both allodial and or vassalitic in nature, and then there is a primogeniture right of inheritance for which this thing will not be dispersed generation by generation. That is finally the surpassing of the Frankish plague that had basically made the entire Merovingian and Carolingian system shipwreck, or at least it had been the formal way to it, because the various sons wouldn't accept a division. But this was the point, because it's very practical in nature as well. Somebody had to control the assets, right? So it was obvious that somebody would try to simply gather, especially as these lordships expanded, more power concentrated somewhere, and therefore it was literally a control that somebody had to physically come and seize in certain areas, right? And even though the system to us appears to us in modern terms hopelessly fragmented, but actually not, because it was recomposing itself paradoxically through that same feudal glue, right? It did pass through the creation of ever more powerful, in fact, patrilineal lineages that would gradually also oust the other elements. All right, and France was very on the fore with this system. It actually existed also in the other feudal lands. We've seen it. First, the best example is arguably the Duchy of Burgundy, since a very early time, since the 13th century, even before. I made a video about that, but it's inherent to the same political institutional architecture that, as we will see, the Capetians would eventually establish and reinforce, capitalize on. Now, the indivisibility of the family dominion, which derived from its official origin or feudal condition, or both, that is either allodially or by the fact that this fief was originally a public district of some sort, eventually enfeoffed to somebody. So again, it was just a formality, but a formality that these people cared to maintain, because both the monarchs and the vassals cared for these chunks to remain identifiable, right? For governing in a way or another, seeing each other's powers recognized, right? So that's how the public culture in areas that had never had it still was, successfully emerging, still even through an aristocratic privatistic system. And this tended to affect the transmission of all other patrimonial property in noble houses. And so it's at this point that not only daughters that had to be endowed, as you know, at marriage, but younger sons too, cadets of noble houses, tended to receive much smaller shares of their parents' estate than had been the case before 1000, because even girls were seen before, like, it's not that they had a greater freedom, right? The Germanic clan, the same Romans, it's in the European tradition, were rigidly patriarchal. Women actually had always easier than men in history, because they were ultra protected, differently from the males who were sent to the meat grinder constantly. They were hyper controlled in this sense. But marrying the daughter of a powerful lord, like, it was not even about the fact that she was a daughter. She could be like a niece or whatever, just part of the big clan, meant that you had married into somebody in that clan before, because power was less concentrated before, and so wealth was less concentrated before. So it was about the clan cohesion, right, that made the political effectiveness. Of course, with less, positive results, because these clans were also kind of always killing each other, and also from the within and so on. With this system now, you had instead only one way to rule, being essentially the firstborn son of that lord who was a lord because he was recognized politically, institutionally, he was socioeconomically powerful in a self-evident way. And so this system was also accepted forcibly, and it was a struggle, right? Because it was really an enormous cultural battle. It took half a millennium, if not more, to be inculcated in the heads of people that had never properly even conceived this thing. Because the idea was also, why would this guy deserve that if he was just the firstborn one, right? But it was just a draw, like saying, what other way you want to find out that you want to kill your brother, like in Merovingian times, or killing his children. They would do that before. This system was instead kind of consolidating. It was more functional to a more stable and firm power, but with some consequences also. The definition of nobility that at this point was kind of more shaded and or disconnected from the original point of nobility, which was essentially a matter of leadership and also even physical military warlike prowess of some sort, because again, that system required it. At this point, they understood they could achieve much more. They had finally means of achieving much more in a collective way, so crushing also this more individualistic mindset, and that's what effectively the history of civilization does. But how to motivate also those who are at the top to be good ones, that was the problem, and it's a problem that we're still facing today, because the overall moral force seemed to be collapsing everywhere, right? And surely by the medieval times, these lords, even though they weren't necessarily as warlike as their, migration era counterparts, had on their shoulders a weight, a responsibility that you can't even imagine, and they would be crushed by it. They had to be up to certain tasks. They were still warriors factually, and they had to take in consideration a multitude of matters that was in many ways much also more complicated than ever before, because simply civilization was more complex and dynamic. So that's why the elite was actually also a functional elite for a long time, compared to the rest of the masses that were ever more demilitarized and subjected and functionalized in other work. So after around the mid-12th century, the patrilineal surname was increasingly reinforced by a patrilineal emblem, what we know as the arms. And so the coat of arms that would evolve into properly this kind of heraldic badge, and that heraldic is much more of a modern discipline than anything medieval in practice. And this emblems had actually always existed, right? The fact that very often they're not documented, but they existed since tribal times. Everybody had their own symbol, guide, kind of role model that was embodied by the heraldry. This heraldry naturally in the past was much more connected to the idea of the beast warrior, with certain symbolism of the universal tradition. At this point, that survived within it, but it was also connected to the place of origin rather than something else, and this linear connection, so that you would also inherit the arms. In heraldry there is all the composition of the arms, for which by marriage, and especially the highest ones politically, that you would inherit ever more arms within the same emblem, etc. At the point that is personalizing, because of course these people were very proud of their own titles, etc. There was a tradition, but let's say if you had always been a French nobleman, at some point you had to become King of Navarre. What kind of, how much did you know about Navarre in the first place? How much you could be. So in part, modernization and secularization passed through this loss of meaning that was the obvious consequence of this system. And it's the same standardization of it that makes it, because in the past people had also, there was kind of a genetic kind of stock that they looked at in the broader clinic sense, but exactly because of that kind of collective dimension, every individual had its own symbol and was identified by a very specific character and This also in the initiatic rites in the military brotherhoods was, very unique and customized. So things simplified at this point in the High Middle Ages, where, however, a very powerful meaning still remained in many of these coats of arms that are evidently associated to the older symbols. I'm preparing something about this once that is crucial, actually. And it would be like those things you can't do, speaking, let's say, to a 12th century German knight and asking him what the hell, those ones actually meant for him, right? Because we know what they meant anthropologically, but it's not that this guy knew about, I don't know, the Arapakis or the swan mythology in the ancient Indo-European times, but they lived the meaning because they still felt it, right? Next to their Christian belief, and sometimes very much blended with it, because in many ways was actually the very same concept. That's what we have been stripped of, the idea that Christianity somewhat was an oppositional system to the one that was used by the Indo-European imperial way. Absolutely not. They were basically the same thing, and just again in parts the same, Semitic surface of Christianity kind of blurred some of these meanings, but because they didn't know that, or they whenever they saw that it was functional to them, they actually revived it. As in Western Christendom, this is overwhelmingly evident. In any form of art that we have cultivated, there is this incredible blend of the biblical and Indo-European meaning in the Apollonian Uranic military sense of the Lord and much more. So beware of this simplifications, because you can't come out of them alive, quite literally. Another very important step occurred, not surprisingly, at the moment of booming of the Capetian monarchy, that is the years between 1180 and 1220, let's say. So at this point, as you know, the Capetians crush the English, to make it simpler. On French soil, they managed to recover practically almost everything that their Norman Angevin vassals had owned at that point, and so they become this ultra super state that takes over everything, and everything that had formerly belonged to the Western Frankish broader district, let's say, as a realm. And there is a much greater change, in fact, in the structure of nobility at this point, because the much larger class of simple knights that had emerged between, say, the mid-10th, the mid-11th century, and had recruited most of its members also from ignoble freemen rather than the lesser nobility, because again, they popped out from everywhere, like the clients, sometimes even the serfs properly, that were freed over time, like the ministeriales, at least in France, in Germany, they remained servants. But so people that were not connected to any specific nobility before succeeded, however, in usurping most of the privileges and attributes, the attribute that the same castellans had usurped in the previous century, by closing themselves to persons not descended from knights, preferably in the male line, and in being recognized as the lowest stratum of the emerging noble estate. Right? So it's, again, Europe expanding dramatically also from a demographic, economical point of view, which means that there are more people, and there are, in absolute terms, of course, more people and more rich people, right? So the castellans were originally, again, as I just said, simple administrators, maybe not even of, but with any specific military inclination necessarily, or no noble or even privileged background of sort. Maybe they were just the most faithful, servants in the Lord's Masnada. They were useful exactly because they were not freemen, and so you couldn't trust them greater, properties than, say, the free knight would have claimed at some point as hereditary more dangerously. And so these people, as castellans, that sometimes were also freemen, by the way, but had gradually become also kind of lords on their own, because they had castles and trusted their lords could die, they could simply autonomize themselves and become something relevant in the broader political institutional landscape. Now, the retinues of these guys or others would become this knightly class that was very aware of itself, exactly on the base of the European universal tradition of the cingulum militaris, and that is to say that whoever bore the sword was de facto provided with imperium in his own regard. And this was actually an ancient reminiscence that conflicted importantly with the state of affairs that this broader pacification and also kind of statalization of the system was had brought, because the same church at this point was, as you know, conflicting with the empire, but for the same reason. Who did actually have the highest power, right? The spiritual force, yes, but where does it derive from? Is it just a matter of physical force? Has there to be a check to that? And you know that the actual symbol of the hierarchic system, the only reason why these systems work is that they actually integrated the both of them. We made countless videos about the investiture controversy, because indeed the civilizational boosting that this conflict between the papacy and empire gave to the West is something that gave an edge to Europe that I think no other country or every continent in culture had ever properly witnessed, in the same way, at least stemming from this dichotomy from the two. And that's the reason why it was extremely balanced, right? In other countries, you don't find usually this conflict cooperation between the two maximum universal powers brought to this balance, right? And continuous struggle, institutionally speaking, at that level is nowhere present. Normally, there is one side prevailing, like in the Byzantine Empire, the secular power prevailed. In others, also in India, there was something similar, but in Western Europe it was unprecedented, right? Even though, of course, in the past there had been a successful blending through other superimposition of, powers of spiritual and kind of temporal nature, but let's say this dichotomy brought to, again, a reconsideration of the same role of in this case of knightly power in the hierarchy, in the system. That became central, as you know, from Bernard of Clairvaux, that was again cooperative and conflictual at the same time. By the end of the 12th century, most knights in France had become petty landlords of the manors they had received in fief from their noble lords, right? And so they were factually just, as a knight would be at the time, whoever knew how to fight on horseback with that specific heavy panoply, and so being expendable for, the core, the decisive element of armies out there. And there was a relative freedom still, right, of these individuals. Like, there wasn't, again, a state that could control everything yet. So the members of the old nobility that had always thought of themselves as warriors as well as rulers were, at this point, kind of part of the same mindset after all, right? They had been identifying themselves exactly in the ideology of knightliness, that is what we call as chivalry, and therefore the military culture of the political establishment adopted, let's say, some forms that would reinforce the hierarchically the value of such military ethos. And that's what we see in the dubbing, in the adoubement to knighthood coming of full age. And as you know, the dubbing was not reserved to all knights in the same way. At least it was in theory, because that was the real problem that also conflicted with investiture struggle, is that originally knights were thought to be sacred warriors that could thus knight other people. a bit like emperors could make other emperors in theory, right? And this was the concept standing behind this case. Let's call it caste itself, right? For the simple idea that, differently from the Byzantine Empire, what they thought, for example, literally that was the only way to become, right, that a knight, right? And it's not surprising in a statalistic sense what the same French kings will resume at some point. The Irish knight himself would think that he was a knight simply because he had deserved his own power, just because he was a knight, and so God had wanted him to have that power and provided him just by existing with such, which was much more in tune with the older universal tradition. As a consequence, however, accomplice with the, again, demographic and economic expansion, the rise of the knights also increased the number of noble people in France, from perhaps 5 to 10,000 in 1180 to perhaps 200,000 in 1220. So it's literally 40 to 20 times more. It's enormous, right? And this is, again, the same moment in which the Capetian monarchy skyrockets and also manages this system that, however, was, let's say, probably also reinforcing the knightly identity because of exactly of this success, of this imperial success, that was in part even feared by the monarchy, that, with Philip II and other kings, for example, they tried to send all this nobility south in Occitania against the Albigensians, and would prefer to fight with paid mercenaries against the English, right? Because, of course, the inherent power of this mass, we're talking about, at this point, a 2% of the total population, which you may think it's a few, but if you consider, again, what normally society was stratified like, would make these people the establishment itself, because, for two people being knights, definitely there were other 100 who were peasants, or almost, right? And, can 20, I don't know, can one knight defeat 50 peasants? Well, they actually can, right? Or at least, because the peasants may not want to face the losses, even if they had the capability, of course, of killing the knight. So never underestimate moral forces in this regard. So this big expansion brought the French nobility essentially into a status group defined on the basis of descent from knights of any rank, because it had adopted in the same time the patrilineal inheritance right. So up to the end of the Middle Ages, the French nobility was more often referred to as chevalerie, right, or knightage, better than noblesse, nobility proper, because it was one thing, and that's why this military nature, right, considered that it was quite remunerative to live like a knight at the time, because through violence you could gain a lot of things in a lot of places, and being appreciated and glorified because of it. And France was being built and expanding and securing its power over weaker systems thanks to these people, right? So that ethos of, say, we are the best of the best of Europe, the flower of knighthood was an actual thing, right? Except once this big boom occurred, as always, these people began to close their own class, right? And this happens all the time. It's like, when you see the democratic booming in ancient Greece, and you see that citizens that want that kind of, however, want just to be the only ones enjoying the political rights, and all the others do not exist, even though they live in the same place, etc. You can see in many ways. You can see it even in their initial, say, kind of the hostility of the Roman senatorial order in having it's a bit a different story, but similar in expanding citizenship. In fact, that would succeed for the empire to thrive. To these other kind of knights, in fact, of people that had gained the imperium through their sword, right? So the Locke of these classes is a bit typical also in the rest of Europe, where it happens a bit the same thing, right? The 13th century is the peak of medieval civilization, of expansional phase of the same feudal system, of knightly power on the battlefields, right? And then there is a stratification, sedimentation, because naturally within the system there are, as we'll see now, some that become ever more powerful, others that so-so, but also they basically block the entrance for anyone else, right? Because they can't properly integrate anymore the resources that come from the bottom, and that press, and that will also bring to pretty messed up things such as the jacquerie in the mid 14th century. But that's exactly the moment where this locking mechanism occurs, that is between 1220 to 1370. That is to say, at the latter end, the moment in which the Ancien Regime was factually established, the lower classes were camped down because they had demonstrated that they couldn't afford essentially to be better than that, and that were kept fundamentally under the French Revolution, right? So for other 400 years, which is a big deal, right? And that's sedimented deeply also in the French nobility and political culture in general. This aristocratic ethos that was, again, an example for all the rest of Europe, and the French nobility was always felt to be, something special in virtue of this original military nature of it, and that's what chivalry was fundamentally about, till even the modern age, where the knight as such, like even as a military thing, as a tactical thing, didn't quite exist anymore, right? When gentlemen still fought in duels, but would leave to the fantasciens the dirty job, let's say, of most war. Now, the period between, as we've seen, 1220 and 1370, brought to a lock that manifested itself mostly in a legal sense. It was essentially the definition of a privilege, right? A distinctive tenurial, a privilege and a duty, of course, because there was no other way to sustain this. I mean, the idea is that these people got power, now with a powerful monarch over them that watched them over, and they, in order to keep up the system, needed to cooperate, right? And so it was always about military service, which is actually what a fief and kind of a noble condition, this institutional administrative integration in the realm of affairs was all about. So there were distinctive tenurial obligations, fiscal privileges, so that, again, I give you land, I give you even less to pay, but you have to provide, because you have to provide me with a military service. And the knights were also represented institutionally, so that they became, as you know, the first estate, right? The nobility expanded newly in this juridical element of society that ruled, in fact, the same until the French Revolution. And still, however, even with the liberal revolution, etc., still, the more powerful people were still in charge, because objectively the others weren't, accustomed or capable or, provided with the capacity of ruling otherwise. So, at first, membership in the new nobility was acquired immediately by any non-noble or roturier. That was kind of a synonym for commoner, who secured for himself either the status of knight or possession as noble fief. But provincial courts, that were to watch over this mechanism, were dominated by noblemen, and they came to deny quite quickly noble status and most of its attendant privileges, not merely to those roturiers who themselves acquired noble fiefs by purchase or marriage, but to their heirs and to the third generation. So in other words, of course, it was still some social mobility, but there was no way practically to become a nobleman if you hadn't been born one, and even if you became rich, you had to wait a certain amount of generations for your family to acquire the title. And formally, it was the monarchy that actually even stepped over the provincial courts to provide this nobiliar status. In fact, Louis IX, the saint, who embodies a bit the splendor of medieval France. Even made a video title like that explaining what was going on in his time. It was a hell of a knight, and also, embodying this monarchic, hierarchic, and nobility principle himself as the head of the imperium in itself. That was at this point fundamentally larger even than the one of the Germans, right? Because that's how it happened. France rose when Germany was going down. Well, there was a Caesaro-papistic ideology behind this. Contrary to long-established usage, the king issued that only he had the right to confer knighthood on a man not descended from knights, right? Because the idea here is a bit like the one of the princeps in Augustan times, that the king is the medium with the divinity, including as far as the imperium was concerned, which also would bring, in fact, literally the Philip IV, his grandson, and Pope Boniface VIII to claim literally the imperium. Here we're talking about the imperium. We're talking about the same thing that had remained as the center of any possible mindset since Roman times and before, about who was to rule in Europe, right? And that now the Empire, France, the papacy were contending. Yes, even the papacy. So this was definitely that's why I said that this brought to a kind of some sort of Byzantine similarity, because all these powers were now having enough temporal capacity to control, importantly, the community as never before, and therefore they wanted to advocate any right, in theory, to them, which was factually not even remotely possible, to a half, right? But still, as far as this elite was concerned, after all, was the decisive, embodied the decisive moral force of the country, but was also continuously competing with each other, would kind of stress the ideology, contrarily to the traditional one, where the knight was knight just if he was given victory by God without any medium, right? This aspect is crucial because it's, in a nutshell, also all the entire religious problem beyond paganism and monotheism, and it basically means the same thing. And it was like the same thing, but again, asking for contemporary people to understand this aspect without any specific competence is not easy, and I realize that, but I promise I will explain that at some point. So the conferment of a right to receive knighthood, by the way, owned by the king, along with the other rights, currently characteristic of noble status, was issued by formal letters of ennoblement, the so-called lettres d'ennoblissement, a practice that was started by the aforementioned Philip IV, exactly mirroring the kind of the formal, satellistic, even bureaucratic order that the monarchs had created. Because in order to sustain this in the state, also there was a bourgeoisie, what would become the third estate, to counterbalance also the noble element, right? It was the popular resort of the monarchs, as always, to check the oligarchy. This started in the last decade of the 13th century, and it went on basically up to the end of the Middle Ages. It was, at least as far as our chronological line is concerned, right? And initially it was kind of a rare thing. I mean, it was evidently against the decency of the same traditional ethos that the same kings felt dramatically, perhaps better than anyone else, but still they were being pressured by the practical needs. They would have to issue this formal, in fact, ennobling letters of ennoblement in such a, again, kind of emptied fashion in part. It was also kind of a solemn thing, right? It was still essentially provided with that ritual and sacrality and kind of sense of power that the sovereign here had to mostly show, but that was in fact entrusted in part in fief to this as a beneficium, literally, to the knights. And we see it's few, like the average is 1.5 letters of annoblement between 1308 and 1314, 10 between 1316 and 1322, then around 20 between 1322 and 1350, which increased quite likely because of the military needs that France had in the starting 100 Years' War. So that there is still a very specific military nature, and it couldn't be different than this in the conferment of this noble title. And just like other noblemen in Europe, all these French ones were men of and at arms, right? It was normal and a privilege rather than just a duty to have that lifestyle. And the letters of annoblement kept increasing year after year as the war went on, and so much that by 1372 there were certain specific institutional and administrative figures, such as the mayor, the échevins, and councillors of towns that were simultaneously ennobled to secure or reward their loyalty to the crown, which was at risk. So this was yet another way of saying I received a noble status by a king that now, if I go against it, will essentially will make me lose my own status, and that therefore would be against my interest, at least in some circumstances. And this tells you also how powerful still the nobiliar status was. Knighting and was something that also in the rest of Europe really was connected to non-military activities sometimes. For example, jurists were often knighted. They had a huge power because they were actually that remunerative for the governments, because they needed these experts. In many ways, these administrators were, during the English chevauchée, the cities were often told probably not to engage, not to, of course, to open their gates to the English. And so, also in the most peripheral areas where the French army couldn't reach enough, this noble title could sometimes save the fealty of the towns, of the cities, right? And so much that their administrators also would not try to escape or to go one against the other by missing that kind of title. Naturally, this tells you how much, for mayors or lesser administrators or even properly representatives could be knighted, how much the nobility properly had sunk in terms of also quality, in a sense. And some have wanted to see in this the collapse of a French military quality that would be allegedly proven by the 100 Years' War per se. I've always disagreed with this idea in a relative sense, meaning that I don't think there is any specific proof that the French nobility was kind of less warlike or competent military during the 100 Years' War because of what they encountered with the English and the results coming from it. But it's true that in absolute terms, this was happening in Europe as well, in every country. Of course, nobility was kind of gentrifying. And of course, also their ancient warlike status had been long lost in the ways it had consistently been before. I mean, by the 6th century, some of these, noblemen were people that could, go into a divine trance and, being chopped to pieces while keeping to fight, sacrificing themselves and massacring as many people as possible. Surely, the profile of a 14th century knight was extremely brutal and completely devoid of any contempt for human life and extremely proud and loaded, but say not something literally arriving to that originally. And consider that the way of making war was much more devastating still, however, by the 14th century than by the 6th. So what actually means is that these knights were becoming ever more elite in society, to the point that it wouldn't need to be literally the center of the action as they had been before from an individual point of view. They had to be in terms of command, in terms of also of prowess, of physical prowess, but mostly by knowing how to command an army and how to properly make considered choices, which is being criticized because of the outcome of the great battles of the 100 Years' War, but that frankly, knowing them a bit, is a very unfair judgment that actually looks at a very high military competence of the French military at that time, contrarily again wise to the common prejudice before actually studying the battles and what the situation really was. In any case, there was also an initial appearance of what, as you can easily imagine, what would become the one between the noblesse d'épée and the noblesse de robe, as it's in the 14th century that the nobility came to be sought by rich bourgeois and civil servants both for the honor and the growing number of privileges it entailed. Right? It really meant that you were exempted from an enormity of taxes or expenses, and all this because they would have had to properly provide with military service, as it had always been conceptually. And we also made a video recently, I remember, when it was about modern warfare, in which we were talking about this problem still in early modern age, was looking at even some impoverished noblemen, as we'll see now, that were just becoming errant knights and not very different from monarchies still, but saying, we are noblemen, we can't seize everything we want. And they had the violence and in lifestyle, etc., to achieve that, but still, was not probably the optimal idea that they would have had. So yes, there is a moral collapse, but this doesn't belong to France. It doesn't belong to Europe. It belongs to the entire of the world aging, and the fact that just throughout the times, this spark of spiritual awareness and immaterial power is fading properly, gnoseologically and more, right, and spiritually, and properly the concept of sacred gradually diluted. So the bourgeoisie at this point, as we've seen, had very powerful posts in the French state, and they had come to, in fact, to great power. Made a video about the comparison between France and England during the 14th, 15th century, how the state was administered. The English had their barons much more involved in local administration, also because they were much less kind of a state by that point. They had gone privatizing by a certain degree, even especially by the end of the 100 Years' War, than what France had done. So France had major statal bureaucratic costs, but this system was, at the end of the day, more resilient than England, also because it was much larger in a way. But it's the formula that did not collapse in the end, and in part because it was relying on the nobiliary elite that was convinced of its own superiority and its own capacity to cooperate successfully with what the crown also provided through its own means, right? So it was still an enormous privilege to be a noble, and it would remain ever more so in perspective. The majority of provincial customary laws, growing numbers of which were committed to writing from the 13th century onwards, all those who were recognized as noble either by birth or by royal ennoblement, were subjected to special rules regarding, for example, succession, property, movable and unmovable, worship, payment of debts, eventually taxes, right? And while there were some rights and obligations that the nobility had to perform, there was still, different levels of them that would fundamentally stratify the same. From the 13th century onwards, roughly, juridical distinctions were drawn on important bases that, as we'll see, would produce different types of noblemen, different levels of nobility. So one was the extent of the judicial power or justice a noble exercised over his non-noble subjects, which had always been a big deal because it dated back to properly either the allodial seigneury that it could factually exercise on, and some allodia could not, the allodia probably could not be touched even by the monarchy at some point, and or what the monarchy had entrusted them with. And justice was presiding over courts, legal matters, provided an enormous amount of revenues. And so it was arguably literally the most important, even before land ownership. Then the nature and standing of the most important dominion a noble held. So this was mostly, in fact, the landed asset. And it naturally defined also a very important background of the individual, what they could put together, just in a sense more directly, right? The juridical aspect mostly showed how much you counted in the system, formally, publicly, right? For the monarchic government. Another aspect was the level of the newly crystallized feudal hierarchy in which that dominion was held in fief, right? So maybe it was not the same amount of land, but still it was, closer to the sovereign. It had a specific function. There was a specific title, as we will see now, for example, peerage attached to it, and so on. Then there was the nobleman's personal military status, which was also very highly regarded, as we were just saying, because their military function never came less, and this could provide properly important honors and rewards from the king, and also personal connection. So kind of rising through the ranks militarily could mean to really having made you gain a lot of reputation and a lot of money and a lot of wealth and power and name, and showing your loyalty to the crown cause, especially considering what happened during the 100 Years' War, when and basically half of France went against the same king, and such loyalty was very highly regarded. So the main divide, as we just said, was on the base of juridical power. They used to say if you had the faculty of high justice, you were superior to those who had just middle or low one, and naturally the lords provided with high justice were much smaller in number than the others, right? So this is a powerful hierarchy because also other lords were under them accordingly. So there was literally also a jurisdictional hierarchy within the same nobility. As far as at least some of also the broad possessions that they received also from the king were concerned, so it was very important. Among those with high justice, there was that were known as seigneur haut justicier, so the lords high justiciaries. The line was drawn between the lesser lords without a proper castle and the greater lords with one or more. So to stress again how important justice rights jurisdiction properly was compared even to castles and land, right? And thus the divide between the seigneur haut justicier was between the so-called castellans that had just one castle, and the barons instead that had that had more, right? Right, castellans, let's say, that also maybe didn't have even properly a castle on their own, but maybe just administered one on behalf of somebody else. So the barons were the average kind of properly knight, provided with kind of safe status, the bulk probably of knights at this point. Barons were in turn divided on the basis of their tenurial status, on the base of principalities and barons of the realm, and on the basis of whether or not they possessed a dignity into simple, let's say, barons and greater barons, or princes, the princes. And among the princes were born barons of the realm, and this a further distinction was drawn between those who were not and those who were peers, the pairs of the realm, holding their principalities as pairies, right? So the peeries, the peerages, and enjoying extensive privileges. And these were literally the highest nobilities. And all but the last of the statuses, the peerage was the most important one, were developed and transmitted with little or no royal control down to 1296, right? The peerage status was something, privilege was attached just to certain very large, powerful fiefs. We have seen it with the County of Anjou, for example, in the historical region series. However, from 1193, the Western Frankish kings sometimes did confer countships by donative enfeoffment as well, right? Primarily, as we were hinting at before, upon their own sons, right, to maintain also monarchic power more cohesive. And between 1296 and 1314, Philip IV laid the basis for the later practice of conferring all of the other lordship status, let's say, both by regranting existing dominions in fief and by, say, erecting new castellanies, baronies, viscounties, counties, duchies, and even pairies by a legal process that usually involved the consolidation of several pre-existing dominions of lower rank. So, in other words, there was a ever greater interference by the side of the monarchy in the definition of which power effectively the individual nobleman could enjoy or could rise to. And it's obvious that before, let's say, it's not a surprise that this ended towards the end, as a general, that this began as at the end of the 13th century, because this is the moment in which France enters kind of an important crisis of stagnation, like the rest of Europe, frankly. And so at this point, up to this point, it was kind of like France had been on an expansive phase. And so some knights had properly just created, they had carved out, maybe not even out of scratch, but autonomously their own seigneury. Think about, again, all the nobility sent from the north to Occitane to seize the Cathars' possessions. This is something similar to what happened in Spain with the Reconquista, especially after the victory of Las Navas, where literally Andalusia was open to everybody for entering, and the monarchs couldn't quite easily control all these knights simply settling somewhere in a castle. Just later on, when monarchic power arrived there as well, they negotiated and formalized the title. But from the late 13th century, the system was unavoidably kind of, was beginning to tighten further the lock, right? And this would cause, in part, some, aftershock, which is witnessed also by in fact, part of the disastrous military defeats of France at the time. For example, Courtrai and the other, quite difficult Flemish battles, and later on, especially the defeats of the 100 Years' War. People said, but basically at this point, the French had stamped great part of or exhausted their own capacity of, you know, injecting moral strength in their own elite that now just secured the privileges and kind of relaxed, right? But this is not entirely correct either, right? It's just the channels that were different in a sense. Definitely there had been a lock, and there were many noblemen who also impoverished dramatically and began to serve as mercenaries abroad. This is a bit the same what happened with the German knights, the ministeriales, that were, except being served, were alike all the other knights in Europe. And that also impoverished at the rise of the princes in Germany, that basically created a lock similarly to this other system, by much more unregulated fashion, but practically still so, and that also emigrated mass to serve in other countries. So this should be observed, in my opinion, always from a base-to-base perspective. It's not just the repetition of some defeats that per se just explains the thing. And French cavalry remained the top in Europe fundamentally. There is some debate whether the Germans had topped them as well at this time, and it's possible, frankly, that the Germans had still greater kind of warlikeness and spirit, but this doesn't seem necessarily to have benefited their own discipline, for example, which the French seem to have maintained always in greater, more collective fashion. And so it was actually a big effort that France was making still, and still the system was pretty much functional to the one. And there was if it hadn't been for the 100 Years' War that objectively caused pretty much stress to France exactly in the moment of the biggest crisis, that is the one of the Black Death and the following decades with the Jacquerie, etc. We would have probably seen a more kind of orderly direction of this all, probably because France would have expanded somewhere else compared to before, as it was doing against the Flemish, etc. That still doesn't explain how the Flemish won, which was definitely a combination also of other factors, but the also positive ones from the Flemish side, but also some advantages, disadvantages, and not necessarily it's probative. In fact, the French actually won the war, and they also won the 100 Years' War. And the system went further, survived. So actually, on the longer run, it seems that this was the right, or at least a good way of handling the situation. And I don't think it's easy, even at the peak of French power in the 13th century, to coming from a non-statutory reality to make this happening, right? So, in my opinion, it's an important civilizational achievement. The system costed, and considered that around the beginning of the 14th century, dukes and other peers of France typically had annual incomes in excess of 10,000 livres tournois, while most lesser counts and greater viscounts had incomes in excess of 1,000 livres. And given that the vast majority of noblemen below the rank of castellan had incomes between 1 and 50 livres a year, well, and the latter group made up basically the entirety of the system, well, the nobility, the average nobleman, let's put it this way, didn't have very high income at all, right? Which is something that would give a bit like in the 11th and the 12th century, let's say, birth to an important phenomenon of mercenarism as well. It's a bit like the lock that linear, that the dynastic lineage had established between the 10th, the 11th, the 12th century, produced an important amount of cadets, made a crusade, and so on. Well, at this point, this system also brings other elements to seek fortune abroad and or engage into other, into a lifestyle that was in part properly military, mercenary, right, and maybe abroad and somewhere else. And this is also an interesting aspect of it. Actually, the 100 Years' War did absorb most of this system, but let's say that some noblemen, that as we've seen, were also, a significant elite of the population demographically, were also becoming businessmen of war right? So they were warriors themselves, men at arms, but they were kind of primarily mercenary leaders of some sort, and contracting, military bands for the same king, and etc. So, but in theory, let's say their arrangement within the political institutional system of the kingdom was kind of more nurtured, than in other countries, right? So they had still kind of higher privileges, and even though they weren't particularly rich altogether, and this higher elite was going to be formed, this was functional to the development still of a more powerful state altogether. It would give France, and this still functioned through this noble military fundamentally, in a way or another, that stability which would allow it not just to win the 100 Years' War, but also to come back again the most powerful country in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages. And thanks again to the unavoidably military customs of its nobility, which were never kind of betrayed, even though, as we've seen, they had been partly diluted from previous times. And it's kind of a hard history. It's not a kind of a progressive, shiny one, but it still shows how the importance also in the leadership, let's say in the command, in the unit of command over your military resources is at some point more important than even the amount of the resources per se, right? And this is one of the positive aspects of modernity, which, yes, does still derive from the fact that somebody didn't see that unity was necessary, but in part this was a let's say an aspect of the same previous system. It wasn't at all positive, as they would mostly like to do whatever the hell they wanted without paying actually, and creating a lot of difficulties actually to the monarchy, that had at some point to use iron fist and even denaturate this function in order to achieve more power, right? And it's a bit the same thing that happened later on in the modern age with Louis XIV, the nobility, and the further elitization, let's say, but still with a hell of a power that became hegemonic in Europe. And the problem being that the system didn't hold, because it was always kind of on the edge, where another, so that the same elite lost the decisive moral support, and also for probably the same mechanism. And the alternative was, as we've seen, disastrous, and it went, however, much worse than it could have gone, right? So even there, eventually the power was balanced further, and as we were saying before, the general aging of the world and the loss of meaning and purposes derives always from all the individuals involved, right? It's not the fault of an evil guy that distracts you, right? If you get distracted, what kind of elite are you, right? So all these conspiracy theories to still pretend that the average people are the good ones, and that you can simply rely on them without, by letting them free. No, it doesn't work like that at all, right? Especially when they are actually the first ones who have lost the plot entirely. So, but in any case, for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.